In front of more than 1 million people, under a sky lit by cameras, lights, and history, Michael Jackson stopped the greatest show of his life for a single moment of truth with his father. What he whispered in Joseph Jackson's ear that night was never meant for the world. But those who were close enough to see their faces knew something extraordinary had happened. Why did Michael break the script of his own concert? What pain was finally released in that embrace? And how did that moment change a relationship between a father and a son the world thought was already written in stone? This is a story behind a hug that silenced a million voices. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Michael Jackson. The city of Tokyo pulsed beneath the weight of 1 million people packed into the open-air arena. Lights stretched into the sky, like stars brought down to earth. The sound of the crowd was not just noise. It was a living force, a tide of human emotion crashing again and again against the stage. Michael Jackson stood at the center of it all. Sweat glistened on his face. His chest rose and fell in time with the music. Every movement was precision, fire, control. The world watched the king of pop command the universe. And then something inside him shifted. His eyes drifted beyond the front rows, beyond the security lines, beyond the cameras. They landed on a familiar face in the VIP section. Joseph, his father. Michael's heart tightened. For a moment, the choreography, the timing, the song, all of it faded. He had not planned this. No one had. But something inside Michael refused to wait any longer. The music slowed. His dancers hesitated, confused. Michael raised his hand. The band stopped. 1 million people fell into stunned silence. Michael turned toward the edge of the stage. And then, without saying a word, he walked down. The crowd gasped. He moved to the guards, through the lights, straight toward his father. Joseph stood frozen. Michael opened his arms. And in front of the entire world, the son who had carried a lifetime of pain, pressure, and silence embraced the man who had shaped it all. The stadium disappeared. The noise vanished. There were only 2 people standing in the middle of history. Michael leaned in and whispered something in his father's ear that no microphone would ever capture. Joseph's face changed. Tears filled his eyes. And the world would never see Michael Jackson the same way again. The crowd remained frozen long after the music stopped, unsure whether they were witnessing part of the show or something far more real. Cameras hesitated, confused by the sudden stillness. The dancers stood motionless on stage, watching as Michael held his father in his arms, his forehead pressed gently against Joseph's temple. The years of distance between them collapsed into that single breath. Joseph's hands, which had once been so rigid and commanding, trembled against his son's back. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. Michael slowly pulled away, still holding his father's shoulders, his eyes searching Joseph's face as if looking for a version of him he had never been able to see before. For a brief second, Joseph looked like a man stripped of his armor. Michael turned toward the crowd, his voice quiet but steady, carried by the microphone he had clipped to his jacket. "This man gave me life," he said, "and tonight I give him my heart." A wave of sound surged through the arena, but it was no longer the roar of a concert. It was something closer to a shared breath. Michael led his father up the stairs onto the stage. Joseph hesitated, overwhelmed by the lights and the ocean of people, but Michael never let go of his hand. He guided him to the center, where the world had been watching him for decades, and turned to face him. Joseph tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He nodded instead. Michael leaned close once more, his lips brushing his father's ear. Whatever he said this time made Joseph close his eyes. The band began playing again, soft and slow, not part of the set list, not part of the plan, but exactly what the moment required. Michael wrapped one arm around Joseph's shoulders and raised the other to the crowd. "One more song," he said. They sang together in silence, father and son standing in the center of 1 million hearts. Behind the scenes, people were crying, crew members, dancers, technicians. Everyone who had ever known the story behind the smile understood what they were witnessing. When the song ended, Michael walked Joseph back to the stairs and held him tightly once more before letting him go. As Michael returned to the stage, The show continued, but something fundamental had changed, because the world had just seen not the king of pop, but a son who finally chose forgiveness over fear. And the consequences of that choice would follow him long after the lights went out. The night did not end when the lights dimmed. It simply changed its shape. Backstage, the corridors that had always felt like tunnels of urgency and noise were now filled with a strange, reverent quiet. People spoke in whispers. Some avoided speaking at all. The echo of what had happened on stage moved through the building like a living thing. Michael walked slowly toward his dressing room, the sweat still cooling on his skin, his heart still racing, not from performance, but from the moment that had rewritten something inside him. Joseph remained in the small waiting lounge near the side of the stage, sitting on a leather couch, his hands resting on his knees, as if he were afraid to move. He had not attended many of Michael's shows as close to the stage before. He had seen performances on television, from afar, from behind glass, from places where the noise of the world was easier to manage. But tonight, he had been inside it, inside the sound, inside the heat, inside the storm of 1 million people calling his son's name. And then the storm had gone silent. Michael paused at the door of his dressing room, then turned and walked back down the hall toward his father. The security guard at the entrance nodded and stepped aside. Michael entered the lounge and closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Joseph looked up at him. His eyes were red, not from the lights, from something older. Michael sat in the chair across from him. The distance between them felt enormous and fragile at the same time, like one wrong word could shatter what they had just built on that stage. Finally, Joseph cleared his throat. "What you said to me out there," his voice faltered, "I didn't know you still carried that." Michael leaned forward. "I carried it because I never knew where to put it." Joseph nodded slowly. "All these years, I thought you were angry at me." Michael shook his head. "I was hurt. I was confused. I was tired. But I wasn't angry the way people think." He swallowed. "I just needed you to see me." Joseph's hands clenched. "I pushed you too hard." Michael looked at him, not accusing, not bitter, just honest. "You were trying to build something, but I was a child." The words sat between them, heavy and delicate. Joseph looked down at his hands. "I didn't know how to be anything else." Michael stood and moved closer. He knelt in front of his father, the same man who had once towered over him in rehearsal rooms and living rooms and hotel suites, the same man who had shaped his life with discipline and fear and ambition. Now Joseph looked smaller, older, and infinitely human. "I don't want the past to keep stealing from us," Michael said. "Not now. Not anymore." Joseph lifted his eyes. "What do you want, son?" Michael answered without hesitation. "I want my father." Joseph's lips trembled. The door opened quietly and Catherine stepped inside. She stopped when she saw them, one kneeling, one seated. Their eyes locked in a conversation that had waited decades to happen. She said nothing. She simply closed the door behind her and stood by the wall, her hands folded, watching. Joseph reached out and placed his hand on Michael's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Michael exhaled, a long breath that felt like it had been waiting his entire life to be released. They sat together for a long time. No schedule, no managers, no assistants knocking at the door. The world outside continued to move, but inside that room, time finally slowed. Later, as the crew began dismantling the stage and the noise of the crowd faded into the distance, Michael escorted his parents out through a private corridor. Joseph walked differently now, as if something in his posture had softened. He glanced at Michael more than once, as if making sure he was really there. Before they separated, Joseph stopped and turned to his son. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone." Michael smiled gently. "I know, but I needed to." Joseph nodded. "So did I." That night, Michael did not sleep. He sat by the window of his hotel room, watching the city lights stretch into the distance, thinking about the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the father he had finally reached. The memory of the embrace replayed again and again, not as a performance, but as a quiet turning point in his life. The following days of the tour felt different. Michael laughed more. He spoke with his crew, instead of disappearing into silence. He called his mother every morning. He called his father too, sometimes just to say hello. The press exploded with speculation. Headlines argued about what the hug meant. Analysts dissected the moment frame by frame. Some called it a publicity move. Some called it staged. Some said it was the most human thing they had ever seen him do. Michael did not respond. He didn't need to. The real change was happening where cameras could not reach. Weeks later, when the tour ended, Michael invited his father to Neverland. Joseph arrived uncertain, unsure of what he would find. He expected the fantasy, the rides, the animals, the magic. He did not expect the quiet. Michael met him at the gate, dressed simply, no security between them. They walked the grounds together, past the lake, past the trees, past the places where Michael had built a childhood he never had. They sat on a bench overlooking the water. Birds moved across the sky. The world was calm. "I wish I had done this sooner," Joseph said. Michael nodded. "Me too." Joseph looked at his son. "I spent my life trying to protect you by making you strong. I didn't realize I was also teaching you to be alone." Michael's throat tightened. "I was never alone. I just didn't know how to ask for you." Joseph reached over and took Michael's hand. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full. From that day on, their relationship changed. They spoke more. They argued less. They shared memories, some painful, some beautiful. Michael no longer carried his questions alone. Joseph no longer carried his regrets in silence. And whenever Michael stood on a stage after that, he knew something fundamental was different, because the greatest performance of his life had not happened under the lights. It had happened in the space between a father and a son who finally chose each other. The world believed the moment on stage was the end of the story. For Michael, it was the beginning. When he returned home after the tour, Neverland no longer felt like a refuge built from fantasy. It felt like a place of arrival. The gates opened the same way they always had. The trees whispered in the same breeze. The lake shimmered beneath the same California sun. But something inside Michael had shifted. The land no longer carried only his dreams. It now carried his truth. Joseph came often. At first the visits were short and careful, as if both of them were walking through a fragile memory that could crack if they moved too fast. They would sit on the porch with coffee, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Michael would point out the places he used to hide when the world became too loud. Joseph would listen. Sometimes he would speak about Gary, Indiana, about the early days when all he could see was survival and success, never imagining the cost it would demand from the people he loved most. One afternoon, they walked down to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. Joseph stopped and stared for a long time. "I didn't know you built all this," he said. Michael shrugged. "I was trying to build a childhood." Joseph's eyes filled. "I wish I had given you one." Michael shook his head. "You gave me life. I built the rest." They began to share memories that had never been spoken aloud. The nights of rehearsals that lasted until dawn. The arguments that ended in silence. The moments Michael felt invisible in a family full of music and noise. The moments Joseph felt terrified of losing control of the only path he knew how to protect. Each story loosened something old and heavy. The press continued to chase the hug. They wanted commentary, meaning analysis. Michael refused every request. The story they wanted belonged to them. The story that mattered belonged to Michael and his father. One evening, they sat in the main living room while the sun fell through the windows. Joseph turned to him suddenly. "I was proud of you long before that night," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it." Michael smiled softly. "I heard it anyway." Joseph shook his head. "No, you deserve to hear it with words." Michael reached out and placed his hand over his father's. The gesture was simple, but it held more power than a million voices ever could. From that point on, the distance between them closed. They traveled together. Joseph sat quietly in rehearsal sometimes, watching Michael move through music with the same focus he had seen decades earlier, only now without the weight of expectation in his eyes. Michael would glance at him and smile, and Joseph would nod. The way fathers do when they recognize their child has become something beautiful and strong on their own terms. Michael began inviting his siblings more often. Family dinners grew louder, warmer. Laughter replaced the careful tension that had lived in the house for years. Old wounds surfaced, but they were finally treated with honesty instead of silence. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Michael and Joseph sat outside beneath the stars. "Do you forgive me?" Joseph asked quietly. Michael did not hesitate. "Yes." Joseph exhaled, a breath he had been holding for decades. "I forgive you, too," he said. Michael tilted his head. "For what?" "For carrying what I should have carried." The air between them felt lighter. Time passed. Michael returned to the studio with a new energy. His music changed. The sound grew warmer, deeper. The songs were no longer about escape. They were about belonging. When he performed again, the audiences noticed. They could not name what was different, but they felt it. Michael was no longer dancing away from something. He was dancing from it. Joseph attended those shows, sometimes quietly in the back, sometimes near the front. Michael always found in the crowd. The hug in Tokyo became a quiet legend. Fans spoke of it in soft tones, as if they had witnessed something sacred. Some said it healed parts of their own families. Others said it gave them the courage to speak words they had held back for too long. Michael never claimed credit for that. He simply lived the change. One afternoon, while walking the grounds of Neverland, Michael stopped near a small hill overlooking the trees. "I'm thinking of building something here," he said. Joseph looked around. "Another ride?" Michael shook his head. "A place for families. A place where people can come and talk. No cameras. No noise. Just space." Joseph smiled. "That sounds like you." Michael laughed. "It sounds like us." The construction began months later. A simple building. Large windows. Long tables. Quiet corners. It became a place where the Jackson family gathered, where friends came, where conversations finally had room to exist. Years later, when Michael looked back on his life, he would say the hug on that stage was the bravest thing he ever did. Not because it happened in front of 1 million people, but because it happened in front of himself. And that courage would stay with him for the rest of his life. The seasons changed around Neverland, and with them, Michael changed too. The air of the place seemed lighter, as if the land itself had felt the shift in him. Mornings no longer carried the quiet weight of exhaustion. He woke earlier, walked the grounds before breakfast, listened to the birds, and sometimes sat alone on the porch watching the fog lift from the hills. He had not known how much he needed stillness until he finally allowed it. Joseph noticed it first. "You look like you can breathe," he said one morning, handing Michael a cup of coffee. Michael smiled. "I finally learned how." They spent more time together than they ever had before. They talked about music, about business, about the mistakes each of them had made, and the moments that had shaped them. They spoke of Gary and of the long road from that small house to the life Michael had built. Joseph shared stories Michael had never heard, about the fear of failing his family, about the pressure he felt to protect him in a world he didn't understand yet. Michael listened without judgment. One afternoon, while walking to the gardens, Joseph stopped suddenly and looked at Michael with a seriousness that surprised him. "I used to think love meant discipline," Joseph said. "Now I know it means presence." Michael nodded. "I used to think love meant earning it. Now I know it means receiving it." They laughed softly at how long it had taken them both to learn something so simple. As months passed, Michael returned to the stage again, but the experience was different. He no longer felt like he was performing to survive. He was sharing something he had finally found. The crowds felt it too. His concerts became less about spectacle and more about connection. He spoke more between songs. He thanked his audience for walking with him through his life. He told them that healing was real and that it was never too late to change the story. The press continued to circle the hug from Tokyo. Every anniversary of that show, journalists tried to ask him about it again. Michael always smiled and said, "That moment belongs to my family." They learned not to push further. At Neverland, the family gathering space was completed. The building stood quietly among the trees, with long windows that let in the light, and wide doors that stayed open whenever people were inside. Michael named it the place of listening. Friends, musicians, counselors, and families began coming there, not for publicity, for conversation, for healing. People spoke about their lives, their fears, their regrets, their hopes. Michael rarely spoke first. He listened. Joseph often sat in the back, watching his son with something like awe. One night, after everyone had gone, Joseph said, "You became the man I never knew how to be." Michael looked at him. "You made me who I am." Joseph shook his head. "You made yourself." They stood in the doorway of the new building, the stars overhead, the wind moving softly through the trees. "You know," Joseph said, "when you hugged me on that stage, I felt like I was finally being forgiven by my own son in my own life." Michael swallowed. "So did I." They walked back toward the house together, their shadows long on the ground. Years later, when Michael spoke privately about his greatest accomplishments, he did not mention albums or awards. He spoke of the moment he learned how to forgive, and the day he stopped running from his own heart. The world would always remember the king of pop. Michael remembered something else. The night a son chose love over pain, and a father finally chose to be seen. And in that choice, they both found peace. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters when the noise finally fades. For Michael, the years following the tour were no longer measured in headlines or record sales, but in conversations, in quiet evenings, in the slow rebuilding of a relationship that had once been shaped almost entirely by fear and ambition. He and Joseph began taking long walks together in the mornings, moving along the paths of Neverland as the mist lifted from the grass and the birds announced the day. They talked about everything and nothing, about the world and about themselves, learning each other again as if they were meeting for the first time. Michael noticed a change in himself before anyone else did. He no longer felt the need to disappear when things became overwhelming. Instead, he reached out. He spoke. He asked for help. The loneliness that had once followed him everywhere no longer had the same power. It was still there at times, but now it came with the comfort of knowing he did not face it alone. Joseph, too, began to soften in ways Michael had never expected. He laughed more. He admitted when he was wrong. He spoke about the regrets he carried, not as confessions, but as lessons. One evening, sitting by the fireplace, Joseph looked at Michael and said, "I spent so many years trying to make you strong that I forgot you were already stronger than me." Michael felt something inside him finally settle. Their conversation stretched into the night. Sometimes they spoke of the past in painful detail. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, the kind of silence that no longer felt empty. Catherine often joined them, smiling as she watched her family become something whole again. The place of listening continued to grow. People came from different places and backgrounds, carrying stories of loss, anger, fear, and hope. Michael sat with them, sometimes for hours, not as a superstar, but as a man who understood what it meant to feel broken and to choose healing anyway. He never gave advice unless asked. He simply listened, and in that listening, people found pieces of themselves they had forgotten. Music returned to Michael's life in a different way. The songs he wrote now were quieter, more reflective, filled with themes of forgiveness, resilience, and the courage to be human. When he recorded them, he felt no urgency to release them to the world. Some stayed locked away, written only for his own heart. Others he shared, and the world responded with a deeper, calmer kind of love. One afternoon, Michael and Joseph stood together near the lake, watching the sun ripple across the water. Joseph broke the silence. "I used to believe a man's worth was in what he built," he said. "Now I think it's in what he repairs." Michael nodded. "And what he protects." Joseph smiled. "You taught me that." They watched the water in silence. Years passed. The hug in Tokyo became legend, told and retold by fans who had been there, whispered about by those who had seen the footage and felt something shift inside themselves when they watched it. For Michael, the memory was not a spectacle. It was a turning point. The place where his life stopped being something he endured and became something he chose. One evening, Michael sat alone at the piano and played a melody he had been carrying in his mind for months. It was simple, steady, and full of light. Joseph stood in the doorway listening. "That one feels different," Joseph said. Michael smiled. "It is." He played it again, and this time Joseph sat beside him. The world outside continued with its chaos, but inside that room, everything was still. Michael understood then that the greatest transformation in his life had nothing to do with fame, fortune, or even music. It had come from the courage to face his father not with anger, but with love. And that love had given him back the life he had been missing all along. The last years of Michael's life unfolded with a quiet dignity that few outside his closest circle ever truly saw. To the world, he remained the legend, the icon, the performer whose name alone could fill stadiums. But inside the walls of Neverland, inside the long conversations and slow mornings, he had become something simpler and far more powerful. A man at peace with his past and awake to his own heart. He and Joseph grew older together, not just in years, but in understanding. They sat on the porch many evenings, watching the light fade across the hills, speaking about nothing urgent and everything essential. Joseph told stories about his own childhood, about the father he had tried to outrun, and the man he had become while doing so. Michael listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes wiping his eyes, recognizing in those stories the echoes of his own life. "I wish I had known then what I know now," Joseph once said. Michael replied softly, "We only learn when we're ready." Their bond became something steady, no longer fragile, no longer needing protection. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side, carrying something the world could not give them and could never take away. One afternoon, as they walked along the lake, Joseph stopped and turned to his son. "I used to think being your father meant pushing you forward," he said. "Now I know it means walking beside you." Michael smiled. "You're here now. That's what matters." The place of listening continued to welcome people whose lives were tangled with pain and hope. Michael often sat with them late into the night, hearing their stories, offering no solutions, only presence. Many of them left in tears, not because their problems were solved, but because someone had finally truly seen them. Music remained in Michael's life, but it no longer owned him. He wrote when his heart moved him. He sang when the world felt too heavy. Some nights, he and Joseph would sit at the piano together, Michael playing, Joseph humming quietly beside him, both of them carried by the sound of something that felt like home. As the years passed, Michael began to speak privately about the moment in Tokyo, the night of the hug. He told close friends that it was the bravest thing he had ever done, not because of the crowd, not because of the cameras, but because it meant forgiving the one person he had spent his life trying to understand. "I was tired of carrying the past," he once said, "so I put it down." When the world eventually lost Michael, it lost a legend. But what the world never knew was that, long before that day, Michael had already found what he had been searching for his entire life. He had found peace. He had found his father. And he had found himself. The night the news spread, Joseph sat alone in the place of listening. The lights low, the room filled with the echoes of every conversation that had healed something in someone. He placed his hands on the table and closed his eyes, remembering the feel of his son's arms around him in front of 1 million people, the moment when everything had finally changed. "Thank you, son," he whispered. Outside, the world cried for a king. Inside, a father mourned his child, not with regret, but with gratitude, because in the end, their story was not one of pain. It was one of love, forgiveness, and a quiet miracle of choosing each other before time ran out. And that is the story Michael Jackson never told the world, but lived with everything he had.